No.
Hey, what's up, y'all? Happy
Hello.
Wednesday, happy hour. Fabulous. Last time, we're gonna rock it for this last session. We'll get started in a moment. We'll give people a minute or two to track with us. How's everybody feeling? Good. Serena, thanks. Tony, thumbs up. Brian, I think a thumbs up. Nicole's not so certain. I can tell she's waffling.
Oh my word. Is it always the case that the last couple weeks of a semester are just insanity? Oh my
Yes.
goodness.
Seems about par for the course in my
Okay.
experience. Yeah.
I'll briefly put it this way. So I set my alarm for 4 o'clock so that I could get up and finish what I needed to do for my Christian ed class where I would be teaching a lesson, and then realized about 4:15 when the second alarm went off that I don't actually need to get up that early. So I set it for 5 and then didn't actually go back to sleep. Got up at 5, realized that class doesn't actually start till I thought 10 o'clock. So I tried to go back to sleep, had too much running through my head, finally got up at 6, took a shower, came down, finished what I needed to do, got on at 10 o'clock and I was 30 minutes late. And I'm like, seriously? It started at 9:30.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, I'm just done.
I'm exhausted just hearing that story, Nicole.
I know.
Oh my gosh. It's just great. It's just great.
Yeah. I mean, if it's this is a small consolation. I missed my all staff meeting at church yesterday because although it was at 10:30 on my calendar, in my head, it started at 11. So I walked to the meeting right as everybody was leaving and they're like, oh, you missed the meeting. It was like, cool, great. Because my brain is broken. So yeah.
Right.
I do that all the time. Like, I don't understand. Like, I'll get it in my head that a meeting's at a certain time. I don't go back and look at my calendar, and then I'm shocked when I'm wrong. Like, that happens to me a lot. It's kind of like weird. Does that happen to you often, or just as?
Not super
Right.
often. But sometimes I rely on what I think is happening instead of my calendar.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want you guys to know that you give me hope, because I'm always attributing it to age, and you all are much younger than me. So,
Oh
Yeah,
my
that's
goodness.
great.
Sometimes I feel like I was born 80.
Oh, like you're just like Benjamin Button.
Yes,
yeah,
except I'm
that's
not going in reverse.
Yeah, well, you can't have all things.
Right.
But all right, well, it's 12:02. Let us open in a word of prayer and we will jump right into our time. Loving and living God, we are grateful for the ways that you have continued to sustain us through the semester, even through not enough sleep and missed meetings and all the things that we can be anxious about, and all the ways that our minds and our lives are moving in different directions. But we are grateful that you center us in surprising ways sometimes, and sometimes through our own intentions and best purposes, but that you do walk with us, and that you've given us a community of learning and a faith community to do this journey with. So as we pause momentarily and as we prepare to talk through this passage from Revelation and the other things for the class, we ask for an extra measure of your Spirit, that we would be a formed and transformed people. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so like I said in my email or my video on Monday, what I want to do is spend some time talking about the translation passage from chapter 21 from Revelation, and then spend a good 40 minutes or so, roughly half of our time together, talking through some strategies related to the final assignment for those that will go in that direction. And Brian set up a office hour with me earlier this week, and he was pretty much the guinea pig for our conversation today. So the sorts of questions that he's asked will shape what I'll say to you. And he's actually also typed up some notes from our conversation that I'll share with the class after our happy hour session. So we have lots to cover. And the good news is that this passage that we're looking at is actually, the same passage that we're writing in a final paper on. So there's some correlation. There'll be some, hopefully some transference there. So that's what I want to say by way of introduction, by the way of housekeeping. I think that's all I want to say. Are there questions about our plan for today before we dive into Revelation 21? No, seeing some no's, some nods. Great. Okay. So I'm going to pull up this passage once again in my very idiosyncratic way of sort of working through the passage. And we can talk around this, but again, I'm thinking towards that final paper. And one of the ways that I've organized this is just around what I would take to be the major action in the passage. And it has to do with what John sees, what John hears, who speaks, and what happens to John. And the reason I'm sort of belaboring this would be a very good way to talk about the movement of a text, right? It's not the only way to talk about how a text is structured, but it's certainly one way that we could talk about it. We could say, this passage in Revelation 21, 1 through 14 has, 7 major parts or 7 major moves. Or we could even go even tighter than that, right? We could say, there's first scene is what John sees in verses 1 and 2, and what he hears, let's say, from the throne in verse 3. So part 1. And then in part 2, there is this dialogue between John the seer and the one who's seated upon the throne, either the God of Israel or the lamb that was slain. And that's in verses 5 through 8. And then in verses 9 through 14, John is encountered by an angelic interpreter or an angelic guide who speaks with him and shows him certain things, right? So that's one way of me saying to my readers or saying to you all, here's how I see this passage unrolling. And so this is not the only way to do it, but that would be one way to do it. And the way that I got there, at least in part, was just focusing on the different verbs and who's doing the verbs and who's moving the action ahead. So that's what I wanted to say in terms of sort of looking at a passage overall and trying to break it into its component parts. But were there specific questions from the group about this passage? Yes, it was crystal clear. Great.
Well, I do have a question, Dr. Holmes. Yeah, verse 5.
Yeah.
So I just wasn't sure who the one was who is seated on the throne. So my initial thought was God, but then Jesus also said that he was the Alpha and the Omega. So that was just a curious one because it says the one.
Yeah. So Tony, I think that's like a fabulous question in terms of modeling the sort of working with the text and sort of, asking questions of it. Digging in the text is my favorite, analogy, the gardening metaphor of you're digging in the soil and you're trying to bring new meaning to light. And that's the sort of question that it could be a sidebar and it might not lead anywhere, but it could be really significant. That there is, at the very least, there's ambiguity about who this seated one is. And so the ways that you could go about answering it, quick ways that you could go about answering it and supporting and coming to your own answer and then learning how to support it would be, you could just search for the word throne in Revelation. Where else does throne occur? When is it a heavenly or a divine throne? And who's on it, right? So 7 out of the 10 times it's the God, it's God instead of Jesus, then that might suggest something to you. But then, just as you said, Tony, you would also then want to balance it with all of these other descriptors. These words are faithful and true. Well, those same words, faithful and true, have been used to describe Jesus elsewhere. The Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, are these. So again, there may be a straightforward answer when you look at the throne and you look at these sort of anecdotes for the one that's seated there, but there might also be some ambiguity, and you might then want to make a claim about John's theological vision. Maybe that ambiguity is intentional, because once we get through the sort of veneration of both the Lamb and the one who is seated in chapters 4 and 5, does the distinction intentionally fall apart? And so,
And for me, again, just because Jesus referred to himself as the Alpha and Omega in Revelation, and then also in verse 6, where he says, "And I will give water as a gift from the spring," Jesus referred to, he says, "I will give you living water."
Yeah.
Right. So again, for me, it was just it was a little bit ambiguous for me.
Yeah, absolutely. No, so I think that's a great. I think that's a great question. And again, I think for you to go about answering it on your own before you consult the commentary is really not a terrible amount of work. I mean, it's about looking at the throne. It's about looking at these phrases, and then sort of like coming up with a hypothesis, and then you go to a commentary to test your hypothesis. And you may not agree with what the commentary says. You may say, no, I this is what I actually think, and here are the reasons why. And so that would be part of what you're doing in an exegesis paper, or a creative and careful interpretation section on an exam.
Thank you.
Yeah, Nicole.
Tony, have you taken theology class yet?
I have not.
Oh, just wait. Yeah, Brian and I are both in theology right now. And so what you just discussed is the whole week on the Trinity. So the fact that Jesus, and we know that Jesus is God, but the fact that Jesus is not only God, he is one nature with God, but he was also present as Jesus at the creation. So that whole idea of, is this God or is this Jesus? Is this the Alpha and Omega? Is this the living water? And the answer to all of that is, yep.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
So I love that you picked out that ambiguity though. So yeah. And it makes me wonder, because the discussion in theology is also about when that language that we use as 3 in 1 and the triune God and all of that wasn't necessarily spoken of in scripture, but I loved that you were picking these things out, and I'm like, but it's kind of hinted at more than I realized. So that was really cool.
Indeed. And I purposely shied away from theology my first semester on purpose.
I don't blame you.
Shocking.
I'm in my second year, and I highly recommend not doing that your first one out the door.
Absolutely. It is a mistake that I made. Oh my God.
Oh no. And I love the class, don't get me wrong, but yeah, if that had been one of my first classes in seminary, I think I would have been like, hold on.
Yeah, Brian.
So let me ask a question on textual variant that may have more significance than what I asked last time.
Yeah.
This would be in 3. And there's all these, and you have it bracketed here. There's all these altoi, altone, altos. And so the significance of, God's own self will be with them, and then alton theos, and then that's deleted in many texts. So this is God's own self will be them as their God.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'm going to start sharing this. Okay, yeah.
You
There's-
muted yourself.
I did just mute myself, man. 2 years into friggin' Zoom life, and I'm doing stupid things. Okay, here we go. So this is the document that I've shared with you, and so the question is about verse 3, if I understood Brian correctly, and let's see if I can have some freedom. There we go. Okay, so, and this is the variant right here that you're talking about, right? Autone
Right.
theos. Okay, so it's in brackets because it's doubted, or at least there's some good reason to doubt it. There's actually another textual variant right there, right? And the little whatever squiggly line, however you would describe that, what it says is that the words starting with met and ending in theos are in a different order in other traditions. And so when we come down to the textual apparatus, we're going to see two things. So this here is the order that is found, right? So 1, 2, 3, met, autone, estai is found in these manuscripts. Then there is a 3, 1, 2, so that would be estai, met, autone. Again, does this break the church's teaching? By no means, right? These are not super significant. And then here is the a longer version. So it's again estai and then met, autone, and then autone theos would be the order for that. And then a slightly different order here, a slightly different order here that does not include autone. And then this is the text here that we see it. And then with just ha theos is in 2053 and so forth. So what's the reason this is actually a good, like very technical or complex variant. But the reason why they've put autone theos in brackets is because there's such little attestation, or it's late attestation to that, the full, all 5 words being included. And so most likely what they're going with, and when they say text, it's the text that's printed above. And so that would be in just a few of these manuscripts, right? But there's a good bit of support for 1 through 3, less, support for these other variants. And so what's the significance of this? Does it make a huge difference whether or not we would translate it? And they will be God's people, and God's self will be with them, their God, right? Will be with them as their God. Do we sub that? Do we make an as? Or is it, and God's self, their God, will be with them, right? That's possible. But it probably the reason why it's printed, and I would have to check one of the handbook of the text criticism, is it's hard to say for sure whether or not someone would add autone theos to clarify, thereby being a later variant, or if somebody would take it away because it's either unnecessary or unclear. And that's where the art and science of textual criticism would sort of be at work. But again, I don't know for all intents and purposes if it makes a ton of difference theologically. I think the basic sense is that God will be their people, and they will be God's people, and God will be with them. Does that help, Brian? You know, I love text critical questions because nobody asked those, but they're fun. Some of them are not as fun, but they're all fun to talk about. They don't have to be text critical questions. They can be any questions about this passage. And I just stopped sharing so I can
Ask
see
a question about 8 when we get in like their share.
Okay, verse 8. Which word are we talking about?
So meras, ta meras, alton.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So share meros can also be wage, I think. Let me just make sure. That's what I want it to mean, Brian, but I want to test myself with what
How did
BDAG
you-
says.
I've
Say?
lost the screen here. How did you divide that up on your notes?
Not super
as you were
well.
going through?
But let me see. I can show you again. So here we go. So the question here is, so what I was calling attention to is just, it's a laundry list of a laundry vice list. So delos, apistois, ebdelugmenois, fornusin, pornois, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a list. And then, you know, if I wanted to, I think probably this is better. You know, why not? So the share of them, right, is the basic, would be a basic translation. So I'm going back to BDAG real quick. Yeah, so the second definition in BDAG is share. And you know, to you know, very often, I'm just looking at this again, their place, you know, the word meros brings it to, at least to my mind, the idea of partnership. So I think the idea is their share, what they're getting, their partnership is in the lake of fire. So, you know, for whatever reason, I still want to go to the idea, the language of like their reward or their the outcome, right? Seems to be the suggestion.
I mean, I used portion, but
Right, good. That's great. I like portion a lot.
okay.
Because that both denotes you know, a part of a whole, right, with portion, but it also has a sense of a reward or a consequence as well. So I think that portion is a good one.
So this would be a place where a really good comma would have been helpful for the thrown into the manuscript here, just
Right.
'cause it would just make it a lot clearer. And I was curious, you know, why they wouldn't have put some sort of just a note to say, hey, maybe take a break, because that sort of ends the list. And then you have sort of a new concept. I guess you just sort of know that because all of a sudden there's no Kai there.
Yeah. So your point is a valid one. I think the repetition of the dative plural is what I think from a sort of just a grammatical level is communicating similarity. And then all of a sudden, tameros is either in the accusative or in the nominative case. That's our only option. And so really, I mean, this is we've talked about this since this summer, that Greek word order doesn't follow English word order. And so we could actually start with the tameros auton. So the measure of those, or the portion of those, namely the cowardly and faithless and blah blah blah, dot, is this lake of fire. tameros is actually the subject of the sentence as I would read it. But you're right. I mean, you're right. It would be helpful if the word order was different, or there was perhaps some punctuation to clarify. A good question. Hey, Sherry, welcome. Hey, Todd, welcome, by the way.
Thank you. Dr. Holmes, I have a question about this idea about timid or cowardly,
Yep.
and it's listed as a sin. That's a very interesting construction there.
Yeah. So right. I think what's interesting is how Delois occurs and what it occurs with. I would want to lead in the direction and then sort of be proven wrong that these are all basically getting at us one or two realities in the world of Revelation. And I think I'm probably channeling Brian Blunt. Is these are people who have failed to demonstrate the nonviolent resistance that is demanded by Revelation. These are those who have accommodated themselves to the demands of the empire. So then Delois here, although in any Greek usage in the world, might mean like I'm afraid of spiders or I'm afraid of heights, right? That in this context, I don't think that he's saying anybody who experiences any sorts of fears is going to get thrown in the lake of fire. What seems to be suggested from the immediate context and then the larger context is those who turn away from the harsh consequences of maintaining fidelity to the lamb that was slaughtered. And so again, this is, I think, the language of accommodation, of cowardice in a sense. My guess is that we could do a great word study here and make the case that the martial context of Delois is significant, that cowards are those who flee from battle. And that in some of I know this because I've written about this a little bit, that in some of the historians like Polybius and others who recount these great battles, one of the things that generals will say to their soldiers is like, you need to endure hupomone, right? And if you don't, and you think that like running home is going to be safer, just wait until we come for you. It'll be much worse if you turn away. So the virtue of endurance, the virtue of courage are all sort of being used, I think, in a particular way here to support the larger rhetorical ends of Revelation, which is, hold the line, don't give in. And I think as Brian Blunt has pointed out throughout the commentary, the demands that the author makes are pretty high. Some might say extreme. Paul would call them extreme, especially when it comes to like meat sacrificed to idols. But that's how I would read it.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, Sherry.
Sorry, I was late. Have you already talked about in that same verse, abdalugmenois?
We have not.
So I found that interesting because it's, as a verb, it's to detest. So I wanted to translate it as the ones who detest, right? So the haters, right? The ones who hate.
Mm-hmm.
But I saw in at least one translation, it was the detestable ones.
Yeah.
So and to me, those are quite different. The ones who are detestable versus the ones who detest others or hate others.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so again, I think that the translation that you're seeing in the NRSV and some of the commentaries would it's being led by some understanding or some assumptions about the larger, the immediate literary context and the larger context, so that the verb can mean to detest something, right? So
Mhm,
like we can
mhm.
imagine a world in which, John is the seer is like looking at what his polytheistic pagan neighbors are doing, and he says that's detestable, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And so that captures that a very particular social cultural judgment on that religious world of non-Jews, non-Christians. I think that because there isn't an object, like they detest fill in the blank, I think that's probably what would lead us into the sense of they are being viewed as detestable, right? Which is not a great thing, right? Like, I mean, this is where we can. There's parts of scripture that I want to push back against. This is one, in the age that we live in, where that seems, to call people as and of themselves detestable is a pretty dehumanizing thing. But again, that's not unfamiliar for the rhetoric of the text. That's within the realm of possibilities. And that's certainly clear in the author's perspective of the BDAG, for example, translates this as detestable, and then in parentheses says because of polytheistic worship. And so that's, again, I don't think that that's inaccurate for what we know of the book of Revelation and the perspective of the author. I think that's probably right.
I'm sorry, which word was that again?
It's ebdelugmenois. It just rolls off your tongue.
Yeah, I
What's-
think there'd have been a better word to have used grammatically, but
Yeah.
something that didn't imply to detest, but
Yeah.
implied like a noun instead of a verb, right?
And
But-
there is an adjective. If you're in BDAG with me, there's both an adjective and a noun that are related. And for whatever reason, our author has chosen the verb, a participle form. Dang it. And there's no textual variance where the later scribes were like, I think what you mean is, because that would be helpful too. But I don't see one there. Not with that.
Dr. Holmes, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
These collections of words that are used to describe,
Yeah.
do you believe, so in my mind is that sometimes I think of these as characteristics of a type of individual, and these are evidences that they are, or are these behaviors that we see that people shouldn't practice? So I hope I explained that correctly.
Okay. Say it one more time.
Okay. All right. So I have to switch it to a metaphor, right?
Yeah.
So if I describe a steak, right? A steak, and it might have some characteristics that you can say, the steak is juicy, it's, got flavor and so on and so forth. It's got all of those things that are going on, right? And so it's because it's a steak that it has these characteristics. Or are we looking at these specific characteristics and says, if you have these things, then if you practice any of these things, then these are things of concern. Right? So is one a fruit of the fact that they are this type of people, right? Or are these behaviors? So if I were to enlist the characteristics of my dog Champ walks on all four legs, right? But humans can do that too. And my question is that is this to be seen as, because Champ is a dog, he exhibits these, and what we're pointing to is not these specific behaviors, but the fact that Champ is a dog, versus anybody who walks on a dog is is indicted in this. It may seem trivial, but I think it helps in application.
Yeah, I think I understand the question. And what I would say is, if I was to sort of go with the metaphor that you're using, I would say that this list of vices provides an outline of the opposite of ha-nikon, right? So
Mhm.
so the one who conquers, or the victorious one, ha-nikon, in verse 7,
Mhm.
the polar opposite of that is described in verse 8. So
Mhm.
so it would be more of saying, it's not a steak because it's juicy or has flavor, right? It's because it has a steak that it has all of these things. I don't know if I can go with the metaphor, actually.
Right.
But I do think that the clear counter to verse 8 is the participle in verse 7. And so rather than say, and those that are non-victorious, their part is in the lake of fire, what he says instead is, this is what it looks like to be defeated. This is what it looks like to be one who isn't conquering. Which then I think it qualifies both what conquering means in the book of Revelation, and something about these specific vices. Because vice lists in antiquity were very popular. Philosophers talk about vice lists all the time. And like Paul's vice list in Romans 1, 18 through 32 has very similar counterparts in the Wisdom of Solomon and in some other Greek texts. And so, people were in the business of saying these are really unhelpful ways to live, or these are problematic ways to live. But I think some of the specificity of this list is tied to that participle from Nikon, right? That the victorious one, who's not victorious? Well, it's all of these people who refuse to stand up in the face of pressure.
That's very good. Thank you.
Other thoughts or questions? Yeah, Sherry.
You may have already talked about this, but the Nikon that you were just talking about, I really wanted to I translated it as conquers, but I really wanted to translate it as perseveres or endures.
Yeah, so
kind of to go along with what we know about the great crowd, right? Is they more endured than conquered.
Yeah, no, that's so I think that's you could support that translation primarily because some of our language of conquering is at least different or somewhat more has a different nuance than what might have been implied here. And here's what I mean by that. When I hear conquer, I think imperialism. Like I think ships of boats taking over countries and enslaving the people. And while that might have been that sort of reality could have been part of what Nikao meant in the ancient world, for me, Nikao primarily registers in an athletic conceptual field and in a military one. So that who's victorious, whether it's athletics, whether it's, you're running a race or you're wrestling or you're, fighting animals, what does victory entail? It means you have endured, you have, maintained. So you've outlasted, right? And so, and that's this, I think that's true also of the military context, right? If you're going head to head with your enemy at the battlefield, ultimately the one who's deemed victorious is the one who's left standing, right? And so I think, what I would do in terms of, if I was asked to translate this, I would probably translate it, the one who is victorious, or the one who conquers. But then I would, in my notes, or in my careful and critical interpretation of the passage, I would want to sort of bring out some of what I think are those nuances. Because elsewhere in Revelation, when Nikao occurs, it's going to be closely related with hupomone, right? With endurance and suffering. And so I don't think that I think you're moving in the absolute right direction to want to translate it that way.
Yeah, Professor Holmes, I used overcomers.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Exactly.
because to me, that means you've endured, you've overcome something, not necessarily when I think of conquering like you, I think of a battle. I think of something that I've actively battled in, and I get that, but it's really a matter that they've endured and they overcame the hardships. They overcame so that's the word I used.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's some support in the chat box between with Priscilla and Nicole as well, that overcomers. The one who overcomes would be great. Again, I want to be mindful that I don't want to make a translation that seems more workable for me, right? If imperialism is what is meant, then I don't want to shy away from that. But again, I think that the athletic context is key, and then the military context would be secondary to that. Yeah, Todd.
So as I'm looking at verse 8, right, we've been very sensitive about, gender constructions as it pertains, particularly in Revelation. And one of the things that jumps out to me is the overwhelming number of male, renderings. Is that consequential, or is that specific in this?
So, I mean, it's probably not consequential in this. You could explore it more, but like Spanish and other Romance languages, when you're talking about things in the plural, if it very often the masculine plural in whatever case in Greek can be inclusive of both men and women, right? It can be used to talk about groups of people, and in the sort of androcentric thinking that is ancient Greek, we'll loop some women in there, or we'll loop some children in there, right? Even though it's masculine. And again, we always want to remember that also that grammatical gender is not always equal to biological gender. Sometimes it is, but I think in this case, because these are all plurals, that we would be in the right direction of thinking about these as groups of people, that could be composed of both biologically men and women, and non-binary people as well, if we want to do that.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Can we shift? Can we make a pivot? Are there any other questions about this this translation? I don't think so. I'm sure there are a lot, and I'm looking forward to seeing in your final assignments the questions that you ask and the ways that you go about answering them. For the next 40 or so minutes, what I want to do is just talk through the final assignment and some strategies, what I think are strategies for taking this exam. And I want to start with something that I got to like I said, Brian and I talked on Monday afternoon, and I think that fleshed out a lot of what I want to say to the group and to the class. And one of the things that we got to at the very end of that conversation that I want to lead with is when you look at these required responses, and I'll go ahead and share the screen so we all know what I'm talking about. But when I ask you to think about these required responses. What I would encourage you to do for this class, but also if you end up taking a PCUSA ordination exam, is before you crack open your Bible or even crack open a commentary, is write down what you think you know. Take 2 minutes, set a Google timer, and try to answer the question with zero preparation. And for this class, because we've been working through Revelation so completely over the last 6 or 12 or 13 weeks, you should be able to have at least bullet points or at least ideas, right? And so I would recommend with these required responses, try to get on paper what remains clear to you and what remains unclear. Because then whether you go back to the text of Revelation or you go back to a commentary, you know what you're looking for. So for example, with the earth, take 2 minutes with a Google Calendar or a Google Timer and write down everything that you remember or you think you remember about the earth in Revelation. You might remember things like, oh, didn't like those weird horses like go to earth and do some crazy shit? And didn't the opening of the seals, like, doesn't that happen on earth, right? And so, or isn't there something about the beast getting thrown down to earth? Again, you don't have to know chapter and verse. It's just ideas. And so, and why I want to push you in that direction is because you know a lot. There's a lot in your brain already, and then it will sharpen what you're looking for. So that's my first sort of suggestion for these required responses. Does that make sense? I think, again, I think you could do that with all 3 of these required responses. These are short. They're at max 600 words. They can be less than that. And so you don't need to do an individual research project on all 4 of these required responses. You need to answer them. And I would start with what you know, and then use that experience to clarify where you need to do some more work. So I think you can do that with all 4 of the required responses. So now, in terms of, well, hold on, go ahead, Nicole. There's a question.
I didn't mean to interrupt. I have like a logistical question. So for yours and for the ordination exam, I have a tendency to want to write the heading that you have. So what is that appropriate? Like to say 3rd required response?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
then to put okay, because that helps
Absolutely.
instead of you trying to find.
Exactly.
Where
No,
this fits.
exactly.
Okay.
Great word of thumb. If you're given an exam and they're asking for like this, I formatted this after the most recent Greek exegesis exam for the PCUSA. So I think when an exam asks you to do certain things within a heading, that you replicate those headings so that there's no like searching for it. That's a general rule of thumb. If your reader has to search for it, they're probably not going to find it. And if they do find it, they're probably going to be pissed off that they had to look for it. So use those headings so that people are clear what you're doing. And I think that's true of the PCUSA exam as well. Okay, yeah. So Todd's question, read or listen to all of Revelation before answering these questions. So if you were a PCUSA student taking an exam and you hadn't just spent a semester with that book of the Bible, I would say absolutely read it all the way through in one sitting. Or maybe if it's an epistle, if it's a shorter writing, read it 2 or 3 times. So yes, you remind yourself of what's in it. For this class, because at least theoretically, we've been on this journey together through 21 chapters of Revelation, you may not need to reread it all. And if you did reread it, it would be a sort of like, looking at the sections in your study Bible to see, oh, this might be interesting, and sort of reminding yourself of the overall flow, but not necessarily getting lost in the details. So that's what I would say, is being realistic. But if again, if you're taking this PCUSA exam next year or at some point in the future, and you're assigned a 2 Corinthians as your book of the Bible, I would read 2 Corinthians if it's been a while since you've thought about 2 Corinthians, right? Since your New Testament introductory class. So yeah. So let me talk about a strategy for this. Sorry, I just lost my notes. Where did they go? There it is. Okay. For this, the first question, the first required response. And what I'll say is the question is, basically asking you to do a word study. I think everybody, that should seem pretty apparent and somewhat obvious that it's asking you to look at gay, because I've given you that word in parentheses. As an exam writer, that's me saying this is probably something you should look at. And so you would want to use a concordance to find these verses where it occurs. There's a number of online resources: Blue Letter Bible, Bible Oremus, Bible Gateway. If you have Bible software that you've paid for, you can do this easily. If you go to the library, they have actual books. I know it's crazy, but books that have the listings, they're called concordances, and you can use it that way. So that's the first thing, is try to get a sense of where is there a reference to gay, to earth, in the book of Revelation. And then what you do is, I think you move fairly quickly through all of the occurrences. And you put little stars by the ones that you think might be important. Because what you're going to find is that sometimes in the book of Revelation, the word for earth occurs, and it's like tribes of the earth, right? All the tribes that live on the earth. Well, that may not be helpful for your purposes. And so you may be able to ignore that, but then there might be other ones that are more important, right? So, and this is, as I told Brian, this is where the dance of interpretation happens, because the way that Nicole goes through that list may be different than the way that Priscilla goes through that list. And the verses that Priscilla thinks are important may not be identical to the ones that Nicole thinks are important. Or as you're looking at this list, you would probably begin to group them, right? Based on similarities, right? So here's a use of the word where earth is the object of some action, or earth is the stage on which something is happening, or earth is it's bad to be the earth, right? Again, I'm making up these categories, but you will make up these categories as you go through the occurrences of the word. And what's important is that then you're able to articulate in your 600 word response some of what is motivating that characterization, right? So you might say there are 80 uses, there are 80 occurrences of the Greek word gay in Revelation. I see that there are sort of 3 basic ways that the word is used. Here's the first, here's the second, here's the third. And it's the third that's really important for understanding Revelation 21. And so here's what the third one is, and here's why it's really important for understanding 21, verse 21:1, and why it helps us understand what the author means about the new creation, or about what we see in Revelation 21:1. So that would be the first, without giving you an answer, because I don't have a single answer to give, because there's not a single answer to give. That's some of the strategies that I would use for that question, in terms of it's a word study. You're welcome to use your BDAG, your dictionary. I would strongly encourage you to use the study notes in your study Bible, because I bet that there's at least a short note that says something about the new earth, or about earth in general. And probably if it's a good study Bible, it'll tell you other places in Revelation where you might look as well. So that's how I would sort of think through that sort of question. Second question, similar, very similar. It's asking you to think about second death. So you might think about how death occurs in the book of Revelation. This is also a place where I think it would be totally appropriate for you to look at secondary scholarship, right? For you to look at what does the study notes in your study Bible say about this idea of second death? What does Blunt say about it? What does Schussler Fiorenza say about that? Because it's asking you about the meaning of second death. It's asking you, what is the significance of this idea? And you will support that with passages from Revelation or from elsewhere in the Bible. But you can also say, I think that Brian Blunt has a really thoughtful understanding of what second death is. And it's this, and we can see support for this view of Brian Blunt in this verse or this passage or that passage. So that's what I would recommend with that. Looking at that. Do those two strategies just make sense at a conceptual level, at least? Y'all are following me there? Okay, good. So then for the third one, the historical situation, this is the PCUSA's attempt to help you show that that Revelation was written in a particular historical, cultural, religious context. Now, they don't expect that you have a degree in ancient Greek history or ancient Mediterranean religions. So this is another place where what is the question asking? It's asking you about the historical context as it relates to the idea of conquering. All right. So if you answered this question and you just talked about conquering, right? You just like, this is a really interesting word and it occurs in this variety of literature, you probably wouldn't receive full credit for this question, right? Because what it's asking you to do is to tie it into the historical context, something about the historical context, right? We've already talked about Nikao in our discussion of the passage. I think that's helpful, moving in the right direction. But again, what I hope I'm achieving in this assignment and in this sort of explanation is that the strategies that I'm giving you aren't just like, how do you pass my assignment, but how do you engage, excuse me, this sort of assignment in the future, right? What are the pitfalls? So one of the pitfalls for the third required response is if you don't talk about either the historical context or the idea of conquering in a sort of synthetic way. Okay, fourth required question. This is just asking you to create a conversation between what you read in Revelation 21 and what the Book of Order says about Christian hope and the afterlife. So very often for this either third or fourth required response on the Greek exegesis exam, they'll ask you to consult one of the Book of Confessions confessions and create some sort of conversation between what a confession says and what the biblical text says. And so I've given you ample support of examples of the Reformed understanding of the death, resurrection, and afterlife, at least as is understood by the PCUSA. And so what you need to do in this question is probably, right, say something about your understanding of a Reformed understanding of death, resurrection, and the afterlife. Now, again, this is not an invitation to do a research project. This is an opportunity for you to quickly synthesize what you see in the Book of Order, and what stands out to you, what themes are there. And then once you've sort of come to that conclusion, then put that into conversation with what you see in Revelation 21, 1 through 14. And the truth is that there might not be a great conversation. It might be a very fragmented conversation, or there might only be one or two elements that are connected from Revelation and the Book of Order. But you won't know until you do that sort of synthesis of the Book of Order. I think that because this is typically an open book, open note exam, if you have something from Calvin or from Barth or from Guthrie's textbook on Reformed theology, or fill in the blank that is relevant to a Reformed understanding of death, resurrection, and the afterlife, and it helps you make this conversation happen, then by all means use it. But I don't want you to feel like you need to go check out a dozen books about the Reformed perspective on death and dying in order to answer this question. That's not the purpose at all.
Yeah, Dr. Holmes, I have a problem with that because we haven't gotten to death and dying in theology yet.
I don't know what to tell you there.
Just kidding.
Besides that, I've given you ample places that you can consider. And
Yeah, no, I know. I'm just being silly.
I know.
I need some silliness this week.
No, zero silliness. I'm super serious all the time. Okay, so those are the 4 required questions. And the next piece is the careful and critical interpretation. And like I've said in the past, this is essentially a more focused and shorter version of what you did for the midterm paper, right? This is you demonstrating your careful engagement with the text. And it is you saying that from where you stand on December the 15th, 2021, this is the meaning, or this is the significance, or this is the really important part, or fill in the blank. But this is your take on the passage that you've been assigned. And so you'll want to navigate treating the whole passage, right, with treating what you think is most important. And the primary way that you're going to make that decision is based on, whatever you think the point of the passage is, whatever your focus on the passage is. That will allow you to say verses 7 and 8 are not relevant or are not important for my understanding of this text for this reason, right? But verses 12 and 13 are really important. So I'm going to sort of go deeper there. But this is where I think it's a dance. It's something that you learn as you do it. But it's your persuasive understanding of what the text is about, of the significance of the text. Maybe you can think about it in the language of what is the one true thing that it says about God or humanity. What is the major takeaway that you would want your somebody to walk away with? Again, that will be based on your own careful work with the text and engagement with the text. So what I told Brian I would do is share an example from Feasting on the Word, which is a lectionary based resource that I highly recommend for those that might find themselves preaching. And Feasting on the Word has every lectionary reading for each week, and there's 4 short pieces written about each passage. So one is the exegetical perspective, one is the theological, one is the homiletical, and one is the pastoral. As a pastor, let me say that like the easy separation of these 4 is completely artificial. But for the sake of this book, for the sake of this resource, they have one column that is just exegetical. It's just the language of the text, maybe some of the historical context. Then there's a theological rendering. Then there's homiletical, how would you preach it? And pastoral, what does this say? How does this shape our pastoral care. And my sense is that the feasting on the word sample, the exegetical version that you will find there, is pretty close to what might be expected for this close and careful interpretation. And so let me put this in the chat box as soon as I can find it. Talk amongst yourselves. I had it this morning, and of course I'm not going to be able to find it this morning. Okay, here we go. Okay, did that go through in the chat box, y'all? Maybe? Okay, good. I see Sherry saying yes. And so I'm going to go ahead and open it on the just briefly, just super briefly, ever so briefly on the share screen, so that you can see what it looks like. So this is very typical for what you would see. Tell you which Sunday it is in the liturgical year. It'll provide the passage. You can see theological, pastoral, exegetical, and homiletical. And so what I want to point out is the value of an introductory paragraph. So the author here says, these verses conclude the argument Paul has been making based on his conduct as an apostle of Christ. His overriding concern has been to help the Corinthians recognize their responsibility to protect against any behavior that would render the gospel ineffective, 9:17 through 19, or worse, cause the destruction of a fellow believer, 8:9, 11 through 13. So in 2 sentences, this author has located the passage in its literary context in a super concise, super effective way, and then says, now here's what this author thinks is the primary thing to pay attention to. Exhorts them to test the effectiveness of their behavior in maintaining the church's communal health. The remarks follow nicely the claim that his efforts are always made in light of sharing in the gospel, 9:23. So in a sense, from that word now through the end of that paragraph, that's the author's thesis statement. That's them signaling, this is what this passage is about. This is what I see from where I stand. This is what it's about. And then he's going to, or she is going to, I don't remember who the author is going to, support that thesis statement with evidence from the text, with a reference to the text. And that would be your careful and critical application. Yeah, Sherry.
If we use feasting on the word, do we need to cite it?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know that Revelation 21 is in the lectionary, but and therefore it wouldn't be in feasting on the word. And I wasn't pointing to feasting on the word necessarily that you would use it as a resource, but that you would have an example of the sort of tight, focused analysis of a passage.
Dr.
It is in
Holmes,
the
what-
lectionary.
It is. Oh, so this is probably the only one from Revelation that is in the lectionary.
There are very few from 21 and 22 and then 5 and 7.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And-
I knew 7 was in the lectionary.
And for a fun thing, through Vanderbilt, you can go on the Art in the Christian Tradition database, and I work on that database. And so for like reception stuff and to maybe just incorporate some artwork into your future sermons or lessons on stuff, there are images and sculptures and things that relate to different biblical texts. And so just a little plug for Vandy here.
I've used that artwork
Oh, good.
in sermons. Yeah.
Good. I'm glad.
Awesome. Okay. I also point people to that lexicon or the lectionary website through Vanderbilt all the time, and I'm glad to know that you work on it. So yeah, so that's an example. all that in the chat box as well. All of the reference to the Vandy thing. Is that what you're asking for, Nicole?
Yeah, if there's a link or something to that as well.
Yeah. So this is the link that I use for the lectionary. Is it art? Yeah. And then here is the specific reference to the art and in the Christian tradition library. Is that right, Serena? The one that I just posted for your specific lectionary or database?
It's pulling up, but it should be. Yeah, that's one of them. And then if you go to like new search, you can search by, day in the lectionary, scripture reference, person, or iconographic content, things like that. There's lots of different ways to search for things through the database.
Awesome.
So Dr. Holmes, what I got away from that is that these are resources that we can use as a template of the level of conciseness and kind of the order. Would that be a kind of a way to put it in my notes here?
Yeah, for the feasting on the word, the exegetical perspective, absolutely. Yeah, that's
Okay,
right.
thank you. But not necessarily cite them specifically.
Not necessarily. You don't have to dig around in them to find references. You can. It can be one of your assisting, secondary resources, but you don't have to go there.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Let's see. All right. And then, so the last section, the application section, I think is probably the most intuitive, or at least it seems to me the most intuitive of them. It asks you to provide an outline or a summary of themes that your sermon of your sermon that addresses your ministry context. So for the sake of this final assignment, and for the sake of those that are going to take this as an actual exam, at the very beginning of the exam, there's always some ministry context described. So for this assignment, the ministry context is officiating the funeral of a longtime member who died unexpectedly. And the partner of this long-term member tells you that Revelation 21, 1 through 14 was a passage that always gave her comfort. And so what you need to do in the section 3 is not just give me a 3-point sermon, point 1, point 2, point 3, but you have to show me how those 3 points would address the ministry context. And so my guess is you're going to need to do a little bit more description and a little bit more sort of unpacking of what you would do with the sermon, as opposed to simply a, point 1, point 2, point 3. So again, what they're asking you to do is show how you move from engaging the text to applying the text in a particular circumstance or situation. So I'm gonna share one more thing that I think could be helpful, maybe. And I'll also post this to the website. But this is a document that I have used in the past and that I've modified for our purposes, because one of the things that I'm very aware of as a person who more or less gets paid to study text for a living, is that when I say close reading, or probably even when Serena says close reading, I assume a whole lot of things that may not be evident to seminary students or people who are new at this. And so this is simply a way of helping you get your hands dirty, digging into the text. And what I would say is take all of this with a grain of salt. What is helpful, use, and what is not, don't use. because at the end of the day, what you need to do is write a 1,200 word careful and critical interpretation of the passage, right? And so this, for me, is a way of getting into that. It's based somewhat on a book by Michael Gorman called Elements of Biblical Exegesis. But this is a way that you can sort of work in a more or less disciplined way through a passage. Again, these are idiosyncratic. These are my own practices. Some of them may fit you well, and some of them may not, and that's okay. But basically, it's about going through the text slowly, reading it several times, reading it in 3 or 4 different translations. So you get a sense of maybe some translation issues in Greek. If you're, reading, you can also read it obviously in Greek. You've done that. And then what I recommend is going through phrase by phrase and just paying attention and take notes to yourself. And what I would want to say is that in this stage, you may not have a focus, and you may not know exactly what you think the text is where you're going to go with your text. But this is all the spade work. This is all digging up in the text and bringing new light to air. And so, these are things that you can look at. These are places where you can go. I think your study Bible is super helpful. I think asking questions is really important. Just like Tony said, is the one seated on the throne, is that God or is it Jesus? And does it make a difference? You don't necessarily have to answer that question in this stage, but you can at least signal it as something that you're interested in or think is important. And so notice the types of questions you're asking. Are they historical? Are they theological? Are they more related to the ancient context? Are they more related to the contemporary context? Because again, that will help you answer them. And then this is just an attempt to do what that feasting on the word piece did in 2 sentences, is, place the text, locate the text. And so as you go, eventually you work through the text and you begin to get to a focus. And what I say in this paragraph, and I'm not going to read it all, is that I often think about the process of interpreting a biblical text with the image of a funnel in mind, right? And so at the very top is a lot of initial work. This is just you sort of playing around with the text, making observations, asking questions. There's a lot of stuff. But as you work with the text and as you sort of work your way through the text, eventually your focus begins to narrow, just like at the bottom of a funnel, things get narrow. And so at the bottom is your focus. And it comes, I think, through your careful work with the text and asking questions and all of that. And then once you have that sense of focus, what you then do in writing your careful and critical interpretation is start with the focus and then show me or show your readers how you've gotten there with details in the text. What helps you see what you see. And I do think, sometimes when I use the language of persuasive, people are like, well, that's very competitive. And that suggests that there's one idea or one way of reading the text that's better than the other. And so I would say from a pastoral perspective, think of it as you're inviting your readers and hearers simply to see what you see, right? And since we're in the season of Christmas, it's that old Christmas hymn, like, do you see what I see? And the answer is, not until you've shown me, right? And not until you've helped me. And so as an author of a careful and critical interpretation of a passage, it's your job, it's your invitation, it's a pastoral gift for you to be able to share with your readers and hearers, this is what I see, and this is how I've seen it. And I would love for you to see it with me. That is the sort of work that interpretation does. It invites people in. It also invites people to say, I don't quite see it the same way. And then, we get into this language of interpretation as dialogue. So that's another thing that I'll post to the course website if it's helpful. Again, some of it is not, but I think at least part of it is helpful. Questions about that? Yeah, Sherry.
Not so much about that, but just logistically, do you want footnotes or endnotes and also a bibliography?
Yeah, so there is a place on the traditional PCUSA exams on this assignment and in the rubric to include a works cited list. So any resources that you use, put them in the works cited. I am not going to die on a hill of endnotes, footnotes, or parenthetical references. What I will die on, and I'll drag you there with me, is if you don't cite things correctly, i.e. You don't put parentheses or quotation marks around material that's not your own. That'll be a problem. But if you're consistent and I know how to find what you're referring to, that's all good.
We could do like parenthetical Blount, comma 189 paren,
Absolutely.
and then have a works cited, and then just have all those things.
Right. Yes.
You not
Yeah.
have to fool with like dropping down the footnotes or the end notes at the bottom and everything.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that. Again, as long as I know that that you're referencing someone, so quotation marks, and know how to find it, then we're good. You know, if you're like, their famous interpreters have always said quotation marks, and then you don't tell me like who's this famous interpreter that you're talking about, then I'm gonna get grumpy.
Is that about standard for the ordination exams also? Or are they
Yeah.
more specific with how they want things cited?
I don't know the answer to that. My sense is that the consistency and clarity is going to be more important than format. Yeah.
And then sidebar, have you seen whether or not, and Katie Ricks might be a better person to talk to, have you seen which testament they may be taking it from? What that map might look like coming up?
I don't know. Katie would be the better person to know. I
Okay.
know that this fall they had 2 Corinthians.
Okay.
So that would make me think that the spring is probably
Might be
gonna be
Hebrew.
Hebrew Bible,
Okay.
but I don't know if there's a hard and fast rule with that.
Okay.
Heck did I save that? Okay. Any other questions or thoughts? Oh, let me do one more thing before we leave, and I hope that this is helpful again. And I'll share this as well. But okay, so this is a sample that I wrote ages ago. I don't even know if I remember what's in it. Of working with a text, attending to the text, phrase by phrase. And you can see I'm just making notes to myself. Now, hear me, this is not the close and careful interpretation. This is all the notes that get me there. But what I want to show you is that the whole funnel idea. So these are lots of notes. Some of them are stupid and some of them are helpful. But when I get down to the end where I focus on the passage, I have pointed out, I think, 5 different ways that I could take the text. Now, and one of the reasons why I get pushback sometimes about like how realistic this method is for like busy pastors who, can't spend 40 hours a week on their sermon. I totally agree. I happen to be a pastor who sometimes preaches. I get it. What I like about this process is that, wow, I'm not going to preach all 5 of these sermons in one, because that would be stupid and my hearers would hate me for it. But I might preach one of these sermons and I might keep these notes somewhere handy so that the next time this passage comes up, I'm not starting from scratch. And I'm saying, oh, I've done a lot of work with this text before. And last time I preached it, I sort of focused on one way or the other. But this time I'm going to do it this way. And so again, I'm a big proponent. Sorry, these are the places where you could, the different ways I might preach on this. I'm a big proponent of saving your notes, coming back to it. You want to preach one sermon. You don't want to preach 3 sermons. And so at some point after you've done the work with attending to the text, you're going to have to make a decision on what you're going to write for your close and critical interpretation. And I hope that it's one thing, right? And you're going to have to leave a lot of observations and questions and interests on the editing table in order to do that effectively. And that's kind of the nature of preaching and teaching is you have to be selective. So all that's to say, I hope that makes sense. I think it's a practice that you can use realistically, but again, take what's helpful and leave what's not. Okay, everybody's feeling more overwhelmed than when we started, which means I have not achieved my desired goal. But what I hope is that you have plenty of resources and at least markers along the way. I would say also consult the rubric. This is going to give you an idea of what I'm looking for as I grade, and use it wisely. Again, that's a rubric that I've created. I don't guarantee that the PCUSA examination committee will use anything similar, but I think it's the sort of thing that they'll be looking for. All right, we're so excited to write these papers. It's gonna be great. All right, everyone. Happy Wednesday. I'll probably send out another email on Monday, just a sort of end of semester deal, but thanks for the consistency. This has been the core group. We're missing a couple people that were here before, but y'all have been so consistent and I'm so grateful for that and value our time together. So we'll see you soon.
Yeah, thank you all for a great semester.
Thank you.
Bye.
Dr. Holmes, I have one question for you.
Yeah.
So I'm starting to accumulate quite a bit of books, and actually, I think my Greek library is probably the largest of all of that I have. Is there a way of organizing them or keeping our notes that you might suggest or reference?
Great question. I have the same question. Mine's all over the place.
So I'll just, if Serena, if you're on too, you can offer yours because you're closer to the dissertation stage than I am. I love Evernote. I am a huge fan of Evernote. And I have very personal sort of abbreviations that I use. So like I use RN for reading notes. I use LN for lecture notes. And what Evernote allows me to do is to like search, like, God, I remember I read something about Apollo at one point in my history of doing research. And so I can search Apollo in Evernote and it will pull up anything that has that or something similarly spelled. So in terms of like notes, that's a really good reference point for me. My books are sort of all over the place right now because I haven't had the time to do more than that. But I think Evernote is a really, really good place. I know people that go deep into the sort of organization of notes and they like add tags and other things, and Evernote will allow you to do that. And there's some other software that will as well. But I think the most important thing is that it's searchable. And this is the one thing that I don't like about Google Docs is it's hard to search within Google Docs from like your desktop of your computer. Evernote is much better for that. Serena, do you have any recommendations?
I don't use any like extra software or anything. I am very organized with all of my files on my computer. And so whenever I take notes, it's like lecture notes, class notes, reading notes, those kinds of things. And then within those, it's like based on the class that I took or, a project that I'm working on. And then I can search within individual folders or just all of my files on my computer. And that makes it a little bit easier for me.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's good.
I'll share what I did with my books and see if it makes any sense to anybody. I have kind of gone by CTS's categorization of classes. So like anything related to like preaching is on one shelf, and then anything related to ancient languages is on one shelf, which is going to spill into a second shelf. But like theological discussions are on one shelf, and I've tried to keep, and then pastoral care, I think, is my other one. So like I've tried to categorize them by that, because then I can kind of go back and, like, if I'm thinking of something, I can go back and find stuff on my shelves. But I
Thank
do
you
the
very
same thing
much.
with my notes as Serena. I've got like, I literally have like fall 2021, and then I have my 5 classes, and then I have by weeks, and then I have like the projects and forums that I did that week, which works until I'm trying to reference something and I have to go back and say, what week did we do that?
Yeah, right.
But you can search the whole folder too for keywords, and it'll pull things up.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Awesome, y'all. All right, we'll see you soon. Happy Wednesday. Have a good weekend.
You too. Thank you.
Bye, y'all.